part 7 in the Basics of Rod Building series, and in this segment we will be binding the guides onto the blank. During the bind process we will need what's called a pull-through. Now you can buy pull-throughs, or you can just get some thin diameter braid, like a 10 to 15 pound braid, and tie a loop in it, about 10-15 centimeters long. Just make sure the loops you've tied it, put plenty of knots in there to keep it nice and tight, and we'll be using that to finish off the bind. You will also need some binding thread. Now I've attached the binding thread onto a thread bobbin. Now this bobbin, there are many different ways you can apply tension onto it while you're binding. The bobbin helps with that because it creates a weight so that when you let go it will keep the tension on the bind. Now to increase the tension of that bobbin, you can wrap it around one of the arms of the bobbin twice, like I've done here, before you thread it through the actual pipe. I'll also be using some clippers, and I may need the thread picker if I need to pull out a thread, and there's a burnishing tool, which is basically for working the thread once you've bound it, just to flatten it out and even out the gaps. I'm going to change positions quickly so you can see over my shoulder. We are going to bind up that guide foot to the blank, and to do that we will start the bind at about 5 mil before the guide foot starts, and we will bind up the guide and to the shoulder. And to commence this, we will take some masking tape and tape the end of the thread to the blank above the guide. So we're going to bind that way, yet we're going to start by taping it above the guide. And then just loosely with big winds come down in the opposite direction to the way we want to bind. And right to there. So I want to start the bind about there. That's about 5 mil from the foot. So I will, at that point, I will square off the wrap, and I will pop over that thread. When I pop over the previous wrap, that actually locks that into place. And then I'll give it about half a dozen turns to keep that nice and locked in. So the other thing to keep in mind is that you want your binds to start very square on. So if you notice anything that's not, any bind that's not square, just use your fingernails and square that up, and that will set you up for a much neater bind. If you see here, there's just a little bit there where it's popped in, and I'll just pop it back out with my fingernail, and that will keep the rest of the bind nice and neat. Like so. The other thing to do is every few turns, just stop and tighten it up a little bit with your fingers or with a burnishing tool. Just give it a little squeeze, keep it all nice and bunched up. So I've probably done about 4 or 5 mil worth of binding there. So now I can actually release that tag and cut it off, because it will be locked in place by the first few turns that we did. So I will grab a blade, and to cut that off I will just pull the tag end up and over that blade. By pulling the tag end up and over, then you don't have the risk of the blade cutting into your bind. You keep the blade nice and straight. Then you just continue to bind. Like so. So I'm putting tension on the thread with my fingers and pulling slightly backward. That way, as each bind is turned, around the blank, I'm creating pressure between the bind that I'm pulling onto and the last bind, and it keeps them bunched up nice and tight. Also just stop every now and then, like I said, and give it a bit of a work it a little bit. Here we go, we're about to go up the ramp. This is where this transition as you start to go up the ramp of the foot of the guide. This is where the grinding the guide feet becomes very important. Now I've come up to the point where the tape is, and that's fine because there's plenty of bind on there holding that guide on now. So I can take that tape off without the guide falling off. So bound up now to about 5mm before the end of the guide, or the shoulder of the guide here anyway. And now we need to start to plan the pull through. So this is how we end the bind. Okay, so now I'm going to insert the pull through braid. So the pull through braid loop I'll insert under that last bind, so just under there. Now, so something to take note of, this is the loop end of the loop, and the knot end is over on this side. We're going to pull this pull through braid that way. So you don't want the knot on this side, you want the knot on this side so that the knot isn't going under your binds. Just makes it a little bit of a mess. So now I'll continue to bind over that pull through braid. Stopping occasionally to neaten up the bind. Now you don't want to bind up the shoulder of the guide. You want to bind all the way to the bottom, so all the way to where the shoulder starts, but not up the shoulder, because that's where you'll create a gap under your binding. So and it will be hard to fill that gap when you're trying to epoxy it. So just make sure that you go as far as you can without creating that gap. So I've probably got maybe another bind or two left before I start to go up the shoulder. There you go. So now I'm ready to cut the thread there and use the pull through to finish off the bind. So the trick here is we're going to insert it into the loop of the tag end, but the trick is to keep tension on the tag the whole time. So I've got tension on there with my thumb. Now I'm going to keep tension on this tag that I've got in my hand with this hand the whole time. And then I'll undo this end and I will pull the tag through just like that. Now I've pulled it through about 3 mils. And it's I've got about 5 or 6 mils between where the end of the bind and where the tag comes out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut about 1 mil off, which means that I will be able to pull that tag through, and that tag will actually finish under the bind and not be showing when it comes up. So now I'm going to grab the burnishing tool, and I'm going to gently work up and down with the burnishing tool, not too hard because you don't want to damage the thread, but just to be able to spread out the thread and flatten it out a little bit so that if there are any gaps, you've covered them out and evened the spacings out. And there you have it.